sent you the link.
You sent it via text or email?
Text. Oh, no. Hang on 1 second. Well, we are live, so we are just waiting to confirm that we are live in the right places before we proceed with this conversation. I just sent you the
The
link.
song. Oh, I got it. Never mind. Got it.
Okay, I think we are ready to go. Let me make sure it's also on my feed. Okay, here we go. Well, sorry for keeping everyone for just a minute while we made sure that we are connected to the right folks. Let me say that I am very excited to be here with my colleague from the Shar School at George Mason University, Jennifer Nicole Victor. We will be talking about the elections and whatnot. This is Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi there. How's it going, Bassam?
It's going great. Well, it's going well. Let's just keep it at well at this point. Before we start, I would like to introduce Jennifer, but somehow I think my audio might be a little low. 1 second. Okay. So I fixed the audio. I hope this is a little bit better so that people can hear me. Okay, so I want to say a couple things about Jennifer because I'm very excited that she's with us and she's given us the time because she's being bombarded by all sorts of media and people who want to talk to her. Jennifer Nicole Victor is Associate Professor of Political Science at the Shar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, where I also teach in the same school. She is an expert on the U.S. Congress, American political parties, campaign finance, political networks, lobbying, and partisan polarization in the United States. She is the past president of the National Capital Area Political Science Association, serves on the board of directors for the Center for Responsive Politics, is the lead co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Political Networks, and her political analysis is widely published, and I can attest to that, and broadcast by various media outlets. You can take her course, Understanding the U.S. Government, at the Great Courses Plus, which is a thing. Great Courses Plus. Jennifer, we are very happy. I am very happy to have the opportunity to speak with you at this point, and thank you for your time. There is a whole bunch of things we can talk about. We'll try to keep this to a 35 minute conversation. Let's start with a very basic notion of what are your general thoughts about what is happening today in terms of the U.S. 2020 elections, and what can we expect to happen? I mean, before we even get into the discussion of more profound questions about democracy in the United States, about polarization, and things of that nature.
Thanks so much for doing this, Bassam. You're like my most tech savvy, amazing media colleague ever. In addition to being brilliant about lots of things, so I'm really happy to be here with you.
Thank you.
So in a way, I don't know, I'm feeling like, we've reached catharsis in a sense. It's been such long and very tense election season, and it's all coming to a head now. So I think I have a little bit of a feeling of the calm before the storm, perhaps. But maybe it won't be too stormy. We'll have to see how things go. I'm hopeful. I'm cautiously optimistic about a smooth election administration. And by all accounts, things that are reports that are rolling in from around the country There's not too many hiccups going on out there. Lots of short lines on this election day in lots of places. And, to some extent, we maybe should expect that, since, something around 100 million people have already voted. Probably 150, maybe 160 million people are going to vote in this election. So we're already looking at 2/3 of votes that are going to be cast have already been cast. So in a way, it bodes well for a smooth running election day, where maybe lots of people won't have to face some of the long lines that they've had to face in the past. So I guess I'm feeling pretty good about that part.
Okay, well, one thing that that keeps coming up, and it's something that you actually focus on in your own work, is the question of polarization, and how we'll talk a little bit more later, about more gossipy stuff, if you will, about the elections and the potential unrest that people are worried about. And I heard today, for instance, on certain radio stations, the more conservative ones, whereby they are actually complaining about how the unrest might actually come from the other side, from the Democrats and their basically constituents. So everyone seems to be blaming potentially the other side for this sort of potential unrest.
Mm-hmm.
And we can talk about this a little bit later, but I want to get to the question of polarization. How do you see the nature of polarization and today, and its effects on, today and going forward on democracy, specifically in the United States? Is this a turning point? Are we at a particular juncture that is different from other sorts of elections? If you can talk about this, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I love the way you put that, because while I think polarization is basically the big cloud over everything going on in American politics right now, and clearly an election day is a critical juncture. It's like, it feels like a turning point. It has the potential for, big parts of power to shift. But to speak directly to your point of, is this some kind of turning point? Fundamentally, no. The structure of polarization, the nature of polarization, the underlying forces that cause polarization, none of that gets changed by this election. So one of the byproducts of polarization is, as the political parties get further apart from one another, the cost of losing an election becomes much greater to each side. So no matter how things turn out, we can pretty much guarantee that between a third to a half of the country is going to be really disappointed at the end of this election process. And that's meaningful, right? Like, people will feel unsettled. People will feel disappointed. Democrats were hugely disappointed after 2016, when many people expected to see the first woman president inaugurated. And we saw that bear out in lots of protests and all sorts of social movements that arose as a result of all of that. But by and large, that was sort of a positive outpouring of democracy. It was peaceful. It was very energetic. It was very sort of impassioned, but it was all First Amendment stuff. It was all sort of speech and petition and assembly. It wasn't so much unrest and violence. And so 2020, the parties have gotten even further apart, and people are even more dreading the sense of loss that they may experience as a result of losing the election. This is where the sense of threat and violence and unrest is coming from. And there's lots of reports of lots of big cities, including here in DC, about businesses that are boarding up in anticipation of potentially some unrest that may result as we get election results and as the losing side becomes unruly. The fact of the matter is, whichever side loses is going to be surprised. Because people are living in information environments that are unequal. We're not living in a world with a shared set of facts, by and large. And so for anybody who feels like they're operating in an information bubble, they may feel like they've been told their side is going to win. One way or another, one group of people is going to be both disappointed and perhaps shocked, and maybe even disbelieving by what happened. And so that creates this sense of unsettlingness. A couple of points I think are important to make here are, number one, voter intimidation is illegal. And anybody who says otherwise, is wrong, right? So it is illegal to go to the polls with, I was going to say it's illegal to go with the polls with weapons, but it turns out in some states, in some localities that have open carry laws, you can't actually bring firearms into a polling place if they're holstered. But that's not most places. And to the extent that any sort of intimidation act is happening around a poll, that is an illegal thing. And so if people are worried about that, or if they observe or experience things that feel like voter intimidation or look like voter intimidation, they can call a toll-free hotline. That's 1-866-OUR-VOTE, OURVOTE, 1-866-OUR-VOTE to report voter intimidation. There are all sorts of volunteers and observers out there that are trying to keep an eye out for this kind of stuff. That being said, I think it's important not to get hysterical, right? And not to go looking for things that might not be there. One of the things about the information environment and the general tense political environment that we're in right now is it is a perfect greenhouse for conspiracy theories and misinformation to foster and grow. So political psychologists talk about three elements that make it much more likely for misinformation and conspiracy to foster. They are when people are actually knowledgeable about what's going on. So it's not that people who believe conspiracy don't know things, right? They actually tend to be very knowledgeable about stuff. So when people are knowledgeable and there's a high degree of uncertainty coupled with some anxiety, and when people are approaching whatever's going on with a sense of skepticism. So when you've got knowledge, uncertainty, and skepticism, that's the environment in which misinformation and conspiracy theory fosters and grows. And that's essentially where we are this week in America. So we should expect that the information environment will get flooded with wrong stuff. And so I think it's basically incumbent on all of us to not spread it. So to give people I think of it as the 3 C's of how to respond to this stuff. The first is stay calm, don't get agitated. The second C is find a point of connection with the person that you're trying to communicate with. Find a bridge to build with that person, even if it's just to validate their feelings. And then offer a correction using a verified source of information that you have good reason to believe is true. And don't spreading things that you think might not be true or that you can't verify whether or not they're true. If you hear a report about voter fraud or voter intimidation or this thing that happened, don't go just spreading it around. That's not really going to be helpful. Rather, make a report, send it to the authorities, and do your part as an active citizen to help alleviate that stuff without trying to draw more attention to it, because that's just likely to create more hysteria in this particular environment that we live in. I do think that we might see some unrest after the election. That's, people are worried. Both sides feel like if their side loses, it's going to be, maybe the end of the world or the end of democracy or something really dire. And so under those circumstances, people may be really moved to get out there. But I want to say that protest is fine. There's nothing wrong with protest. There's nothing wrong with expressing disappointment or expressing, political solidarity with your side. But what is wrong is violence and, attacking people on the other side. That's where things can really get out of control. And that's the type of response that we see in non-democratic societies to elections. And so I'd really like to think that the United States doesn't go there this year, but, we've seen so many violations of democratic norms over the last period that, it wouldn't be too surprising if we see some of that happen around this election.
Thanks, Jennifer. There is actually, I did not anticipate this, but there are a couple of quick questions. May I about what you just shared earlier? Is it okay to share, or should we wait?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
You okay? You okay? Okay. So this is a question from a professor who is a colleague of ours at UC Davis. She asks, is it fair to frame the potential violence in terms of two sides, in quotation marks, when Trump has given clear indications that he may not respect the process? So the threat does not seem evenly distributed, even though I had just said right before Professor Davis, also from UC Davis. UC. Did I say UC Davis earlier?
You did.
I think it's UC San Diego. I apologize. So basically, I had already
You
shared
know, I'm a
earlier.
UCSD alum, Hassan. You can't get that wrong.
Oh, okay. So you guys have a similar connection. So I was saying earlier, I was listening to WMAL this morning, and I do this a lot because I want to just understand what is going on the on the Republican side, and half of the talk is about how the fear is that the Democrats are going to the streets, whereas everything I know and everything I have been listening to and watching is actually, I mean, doesn't really support these kinds of claims. So the question is it fair to frame it in to frame the potential violence in terms of two sides when one side has been much more vocal about not respecting the process?
Yeah, no, I'm sympathetic to the criticisms that folks have about both sidesing a debate that is clearly much more one-sided. And so I don't mean to suggest that we need to try to treat violations as equal when in fact they may not be. But to be perfectly honest, like I don't really find the idea of to frame or not to frame something as having two sides to be all that particularly useful. I'd much rather just encourage all of us to talk about things publicly from a basis of shared facts and shared information, and helping people to decide what is true. So if and some of that helps, we can lean on political science literature actually. So I assume this might be a political scientist who's asking this. So talking about the importance of elite messaging. So, yes, President Trump, whether he wins or loses the election, is likely to claim that there has been fraud in this election. He won the election in 2016, yet claimed there was fraud. A lot of folks believe that it has to do with him having lost the popular vote and him not wanting to sort of accept that. Fact of the matter is, he has been using all sorts of messaging throughout the campaign about the potential fraud, and he uses messages that sort of drum up not just the anxiety, but the tendency towards sort of violence. The framework that motivates Republican voters in the current environment has to do with security, has to do with telling people who to be afraid of and identifying threats and telling people how they can keep themselves secure. And so all of that messaging, whether it has to do with a political campaign or a policy issue or getting people to vote or how to respond to an election, it's all in this same communication framework about threats and making people feel afraid and helping them to identify what they should be afraid of. And that's very much more happening from Republican messaging and the elite communication coming from the president himself. So I do think it's fair to point that out. On the other hand, I also think it's important for us to share information with audiences in ways that they can receive it and they can hear what we are saying. And if they hear what we are saying as an accusation that makes people immediately defensive, I just like to try to find ways to frame information in ways that won't make people feel defensive. Sometimes that gets sort of the other side up in arms because they feel like we're not being accurate enough. But I just favor, again, be accurate. Just describe what we know. Say that elite messaging matters. If the president is claiming fraud without evidence, then that's a problem. If other people are claiming fraud and they're bringing evidence of that fraud, then that's something that should be evaluated. Right? So it's all about me leaning on what we know, why we know it, and what that tells us about what's going on in the democracy. So that's kind of where I try to focus my attention.
Thanks, Jennifer. I thank you very much for this. I think it's totally fair to address matters, especially at this time, in a way that doesn't push all the way to the other side, because the idea is also to get people to think much more than be defensive, even though as you shared, the facts are inevitable. Let me make a correction. So Professor Davis, Muriam Hali Davis, is from UC Santa Cruz. So neither is she from Irvine or UCSD or UC Davis. It's UC Santa Cruz. I apologize. I should know that. I speak with Muriam every other day. So
like Berkeley and UCLA and Merced and Riverside feel very left out right now.
Yeah, I know. Okay, so the Davis is from California. All right. So basically, this is actually the sort of thing that I think is important, and that is to understand that there is this moment where hopefully the polarization has left enough people in the middle so that this sort of discourse can cause some reflection, because it's obvious that some people on either side are just not willing to reflect even. I mean, this is the sort of thing that you see. I mean, I follow election news. I'm not an expert on US politics, but I follow election news very closely. I don't know why, but this is one thing I follow very closely. And it's almost like people's minds are made up more than I have ever seen. But there is still, I hope, like some sort of middle that could recognize that it's a good thing to rethink based on what we are seeing and observing at this moment and in the past few weeks. All right, so there's another question that I'd like to shoot out that has to do with the future. Would you think, I mean, I know you and I talked about this before, about what might happen afterwards if either party wins in terms of the quality and richness and depth of debates and conversations? Is it fair to say if the Democrats win, we would have a deeper, richer conversation about more radical change in terms of how we approach, like, literally everything, including the question of elections and campaign finance and whatever it is that is on the table, whatever it is that is salient, not least the question of race in the United States and things of that sort. What would you think Democrats do with that authority if they actually do win, and maybe also the other side? And then I have one more question about going beyond Democrats and Republicans, because as far as I have been witnessing elections for probably 35 years now, it's almost sad that these are our only choices, simply because of the impact of the United States, of course, locally, but also internationally. So I'll ask about that a bit later. But for now, is it true that the Democrats may open the door more for more serious discussion in this country?
Yeah, so I think we'll have to see. The way that I think about this is polarization is unfortunately sort of a self-perpetuating phenomenon. Once a society has the conditions that help to generate strong partisan polarization, it can be very difficult to correct for that, because it helps to germinate itself and perpetuate itself. So the way that I think about things is the current path of polarization that the United States is on has its roots in the early 1970s. And got started sort of slowly at first, but over the last number of years has really accelerated. It's important, a couple of characteristics about it that I think are important to understand. One is that political elites, and I'm using the term elites here in the political science term, not the way that most people use it, which is just to say that, like, elected people in office, that's what I mean to say when I say elites, or party leaders or people like that. Elites are much more polarized than the general public, right? So there are still a lot of things the general public agrees on, particularly when it comes to democratic values. But it's the elites that are much more polarized than the general public. That being said, we have seen much more polarization even among voters in the general public that has been increasing, particularly over the last 10 years or so. The problem with polarization is that it has the effect of reducing democratic norms. So there are two main democratic norms that political scientists talk about that help to perpetuate democracy and shore it up. There's some more technical language that gets used, but at the end of the day, it comes down to respect and restraint. That is, political actors have to respect one another's right to participate in politics, in the policy arena, in the political arena, in the electoral arena. When we get to a point where we no longer respect one another's right to participate, because one side sees the other side as dangerous or threatening and vice versa, and so we no longer respect their right to compete, then that's a violation of a democratic norm that winds up creating instability in democracy. And restraint is the idea that when parties come into power, they restrain themselves. They don't do everything they possibly can to try to get an advantage over the other side. out of a sense of mutual respect or out of a sense of anticipation of being in the minority someday and not wanting to be run roughshod over yourself. Whatever the incentives are, as polarization increases, reduces political actors' tendencies towards respect and restraint, and that's what causes democracy to decline. And that's what we've been participating in and experiencing over the last few years in the United States. And, President Trump himself, he violates democratic norms almost on a daily basis. The way that he tells untruths, the way that he speaks about his political opponents and threatens people and encourages violence. There's just a lot of much more sort of authoritarian rhetoric that he uses to sort of drum up support among his core supporters. It was part of his strategy for getting elected, and it's the part of the strategy that he's been using through his presidency. He is not a policy-focused guy. The Republican Party is not focused or organized around particular policy goals outside of maybe tax cuts and Supreme Court appointments, both of which they got in good number. Beyond that, what's holding the party together is some of this sort of more demagoguery type of rhetoric that President Trump leans on. That is a violation of norms. So the question is, if Democrats win this election, what do they do about that? What do they do if they come into power? And let's say they've got the president and they've got both chambers of Congress. So in my mind, they kind of have two options. And then I think there's a bit of a third option that might combine the two. They can either go all out for policy. They can do, racial justice, criminal justice, immigration reform, healthcare reform, voting rights, gun control. They can, tax policy. They might just try to get whatever wins they can, infrastructure, climate change, whatever policy wins they can on sort of bread and butter issues that hold the Democratic coalition together, that they think they might be able to make progress on, that might give them a record to run on in the next election. That's sort of like the typical way we think of electoral politics and policy working together. But on the other hand, you might say what Democrats should do, should they gain authority, is eliminate the filibuster and then do whatever they can to shore up democracy, to try to eliminate the sources of polarization that have brought us to this sort of brink in the first place. And to me, what that looks like is anything that you can do to reduce income inequality and wealth inequality, especially across racial categories in the United States, would help to begin the seeds of alleviating polarization. Inequality is one of the chief sources of polarization in politics. Anything you can do to shore up democratic rights and elections. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, shoring up the Voting Rights Act that passed in 1965 that's been weakened since 2013. Thinking about expanding representation, making the House of Representatives larger, talking about statehoods for things like DC, Puerto Rico. By the way, we need to be paying attention to what happens to the item on the ballot in Puerto Rico about statehood. But anything that Democrats could do to sort of shore up democracy, improve Americans' sense of connection with their representatives and their sense of being represented in government, that how closely they feel they're being represented and connected to their elected officers. Those things are much harder to do. They require more political capital in a lot of sense. And in some cases, they might even require constitutional amendments if you start talking about things like the Senate or the Electoral College. And so you might think Democrats are unlikely to do that because they're very hard, even though they might be the most productive things that they do for democracy. I tend to think there's a little bit of a sweet spot in the middle ground. There are some things that the Democrats could do if they have power that could both advance their policy goals and help to shore up democracy, right? So if you do things on income inequality, racial justice, and voting rights, all three of those areas help to address the core sources of inequality, or polarization in the United States by addressing inequality, and help to expand people's access to the ballot and voting rights. These are things that both advance democracy and would help contribute to advancing Democrats' policy goals that they tend to put at the highest part of their agenda. So I'm sort of hoping that's, if the Democrats come into power, that's the type of stuff that they would focus on. Because at the end of the day, the polarization is still with us. Donald Trump's not going anywhere. If he loses the election, he's, the likely candidate to be nominated by Republicans in 2024. None of the conditions that created where we are will go away, except that we will have leaders in office who are much more likely, in most cases, to respect the core democratic norms of hopefully respect and restraint. Although I think there will be a lot of pressure and temptation from the left for Democrats to sort of play the same game that Trump and McConnell have played that violates some of those norms.
Wow, thank you, Jennifer. This was like half a course. I'm glad we're recording this because I'd like to take some notes later. I couldn't because I'm trying to produce and add some things on the feed, including your bio, because it's really important that that we have someone like you, because you're speaking from beyond just you study this material, you research it, and obviously you're like a top-notch expert, and I really appreciated you coming on. Let me just say for those who just joined us that we are here with Jennifer Victor, who, as you could see from the feed, I'm not sure if people can actually read the note. Might be a little the font might be a little small. This is Jennifer Nicole Victor, who's an associate professor of political science at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. My esteemed colleague. She's an expert on U.S. Congress, American political parties, campaign finance, political networks, lobbying, and partisan polarization in the United States. Okay, so Jennifer, my last question before we can either close because I know you're busy, or just gossip a little bit about the things that people are like fuming in their homes everywhere. But first, can you tell me a little bit? I mean, this is something that I have been interested in for as long as I can remember. I mean, starting when I was reading Alexis de Tocqueville at George Mason, actually, in the 80s, when I was an undergraduate student, about the United States and its mores and the two-party system and the middle, the importance of the center and the middle of the United States, which gave way to, in part, gave way to this, 200 plus years of a two-party system. What is the fate of the two-party system in relation to what has been happening in the past few years? Is it something that, are there any signs that there might be any positive developments or cracks that would produce positive developments in terms of opening the playing field a little bit? Again, I am I don't have basically the I guess the knowledge to opine intelligently about this, and but I'm very curious about this question. Are we stuck with two parties?
So as long as we have the electoral rule that we have, we will have two parties. So there's a theorem in political science, Duverger's law, tells us that any political system that uses first past the post elections, whoever gets the most votes wins, and uses single member districts, that is, elect one representative from each congressional district to go to the House of Representatives, will actually tend to have two political parties. Now, it doesn't mean you have to have the same two political parties all over the country. And one could argue we, in fact, don't. But it's really hard to create multiple party systems under the electoral rules we have right now. It just tends to fall apart. There just isn't any incentive or room for third parties to win seats under these conditions. So there is a movement in the United States to Lee Drutman, a political scientist, a friend and colleague in Washington, D.C., who has a new book out called The Two-Party Doom Loop, in which he essentially argues that we need, as a very diverse and multiracial society, the United States needs multi-partyism in order to try to make true this promise of democracy that we've got. And until we change our electoral laws, it'll never work. And so what we need are a movement towards things like multi-member congressional districts. That is, instead of thinking of yourself as living in a congressional district that elects one person to Congress, imagine your district being much larger than it is now, and you elect 5 people from your district, perhaps, to go to Congress. And that is nicely coupled with something like ranked choice voting, where when you go to vote, you're not just voting yes or no on a particular candidate or between two candidates. Rather, you're taking maybe 10 candidates that are presented towards you and ranking them in your order of preference. And under systems where people can do this, where they can elect multiple people at once and rank their choices on their ballot, you wind up with multi-partyism. This is absolutely possible to do in the United States. It is absolutely possible to do without amending the Constitution. You do have to change a couple of laws in Congress, but we've got lots of good evidence that there's, that this can work. There's about 10 state legislatures that use some form of multi-member districts at the state level. And we're seeing much more frequent use of ranked choice voting. The whole state of Maine and the whole city of New York is using ranked voting in elections these days to good effect. And so while there may be some downsides, there's an argument made that if we had more parties, we would have more gridlock and the policy wouldn't necessarily get better, but representation would get better. And participation in that way might get better. And that's really important for a democracy. So I do think that thinking about expanding the size of the House, moving to ranked choice voting in multi-member districts would be a fundamental change in the United States, but it's something we should have serious conversations about and start talking about more publicly, because I do think it could improve our situation quite a lot. That said, without those changes, we will have two parties for the foreseeable future, and we will continue to have polarization between these parties until we can address issues of inequality and other changes in law that have brought us to the point.
Thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate the time you have taken to be with us. And although I think this might not all be over tonight in the sense that we're not going to have some sort of conclusion tonight. I hope that we could actually speak again. I mean, I'm being greedy here, but we have actually had lots of people interested. I'm getting like private messages. I don't know why I'm getting private messages instead of public ones as well. So I hope we could do this again. But before I let you go, is there anything that is sort of on the gossipy side or on the lighter side or on the more layperson side that we could address quickly in terms of, let's say, the question of potential unrest and where it might happen, and whether there are scenarios that we could see unfolding in the next couple of days in terms of this topic, which is almost as big as the election itself. Would you like to address any of that, or would you want to pass?
I would say at risk of offending your very audience that you're reaching here, the best thing people can do right now is frankly turn off the media, like go for a walk, go read a book, like go to work, like go do some other stuff and enjoy your kids or your pets or your spouse or whatever. Do something else for a while, that's something that's good for your community or good for yourself, whatever. Stay away from the media, because basically we're not really going to know anything, until this evening. And even then, the information is going to come in pretty slowly. And so we really need to be patient about waiting for these outcomes. I think that, there will be a lot of media who are going to be really anxious to help meet people's, punch people's desire to know what's up. And so there will be some incentive to try to, go through, as the screen you're showing right now is showing on MSNBC, I think that is, or NBC, what if scenarios and projected winners and all this kind of stuff. And, you can just drive yourself crazy with all of that. And so better not to let yourself get too worked up. Wait until polls closed. Wait until you get actual results that come in from the Associated Press, which is the gold standard that we should pay attention to. What I think is going to happen is there's going to be a really awkward period. It'll be somewhere between, as few as 6 hours, but as many as 36 hours, where, because some states have been called and many other states will be outstanding, but the states that have been called will be very telling for those of us who study elections and understand how things are correlated. That we're going to feel like we know who's won, but we won't be able to say it with any certainty or confidence. Nothing will have been officially called yet. And that to me is a little bit of a danger spot. It's a little bit that period of time that I think is going to be between about 11 p.m. tonight and about noon tomorrow, where a lot of people are going to feel like they know the result before the result has happened. And the people who have won, so to speak, during that period are going to feel elated and relieved and want to share about it and celebrate it, even though it won't really be certain yet. And people who have lost are going to start crying fraud and foul and wait for the votes to be counted. And so I really think that is the danger period for conspiracy theory, and we should all just try to relax and try to wait for those final results to come in before anybody pops any corks or organizes any protests.
Exactly. Except that hopefully they will wait until this is over, which will be over in just a couple of minutes. We actually budgeted for about 35 minutes, and we're hitting 35 full minutes of really insightful comments, and I really appreciate the breadth that you brought to this discussion. And yes, maybe we should all turn off the all sorts of media, but what's one more day, right? I mean, we'll see. Okay.
What harm could it do, really?
Yeah, I mean, what's special about today after all? Okay, so I thank you again, Jennifer. I cannot say I'll see you back at school or at George Mason, where we see each other, because your office is a few doors down, because we're not going back to school, definitely not this semester. But I hope to see you and talk with you again here on this, which could take many different directions on this in these conversations, which could be part of what we have at Char, which is a project you and I are involved in with a few other members, called Char Conversations at George Mason. So we'll see how it goes, and hopefully things will be just fine.
Hopefully so. It's been my honor to be with you, Bassam. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks, Jennifer. Take care. Goodbye, everybody. See you soon on my Facebook page or somewhere. Hopefully, everybody is gonna be safe. So as I keep saying, stay safe and stay together. Bye bye.